Hello, High Rock. Welcome to our daily devotional. And we are continuing with our Advent series. And today we are in Psalm 89, verses 1 through 4. We're going to look again at another promise, one that is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. So we are in Psalm 89, verses 1 through 4, where we read the following: A psalm of Ethan the Ezrahite. I will sing of the Lord's unfailing love forever. Young and old will hear of your faithfulness. Your unfailing love will last forever. Your faithfulness is as enduring as the heavens. The Lord said, I have made a covenant with David, my chosen servant. I have sworn this oath to him. I will establish your descendants as kings forever. They will sit on your throne from now until eternity. Salah.
And this is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. This is, there are many facets to the promises of God, even the promises that center around Messiah. Like, for instance, one of the most familiar during Christmas time is that there's this promise of God being with us, which is embodied in the name Emmanuel. But also here we see another dimension to God's promise about the Messiah, and that is that the Messiah will be a descendant of King David, a kingly descendant of David, and one who will sit on the throne forever, or literally that King David's descendants will sit on the throne forever. Now, King David, why is King David so special? King David is famously called a man after God's own heart. That's left for us to explain why. I think a couple reasons come to the surface. One, David was, for all his faults and all his failings, he was a faithful king. He kept faithfulness to the Lord as a central goal. And even when he stumbled, whenever he got back up, he was always seeking to honor God. Another dimension to his life was that we see this pattern of inclusion of outsiders into the people of Israel, all the way from the Exodus, where people like Caleb were outsiders who were included into the people. And it was always into the tribe of Judah. And King David continues that pattern in an accelerated fashion. Probably no one more than King David in the Old Testament was someone who would include outsiders into Israel through the tribe of Judah. So that's another aspect to his faithfulness, one that kind of sets a pattern for what Jesus will ultimately do in a far, far greater fashion. But another aspect to his faithfulness is that King David was always was more interested in building God's house than building his own. He wanted to build the temple for God. Now, God did not allow him to do this. And one of the reasons he gave was that David was a man who had blood on his hands. God said that he was going to have the one who builds his temple to be someone of peace. And so that would be David's son, King Solomon. And the promise made to King David, we see in verse 4, I will establish your descendants as kings forever. They will sit on your throne from now until eternity. But one of the difficulties in this promise is we have to contrast that with where this psalm goes. This psalm starts off with all this praise of God and remembering this rock solid promise that God had given. And then the rest of the psalm goes into all the ways that the people are failing to see that promise lived out. They can't see God honoring this promise. In verse 49 through the end, it says, Lord, where is your unfailing love? You promised it to David with a faithful pledge. Consider, Lord, how your servants are disgraced. I carry in my heart the insults of so many people. Your enemies have mocked me, O Lord. They mock your anointed king wherever he goes. So immediately after David, his descendant Solomon becomes king. He's able to build a temple. And because of Solomon's, for all his wisdom, his lack of wisdom in some ways, his unfaithfulness, his idolatry, his heavy taxation, all of this led to a split of the kingdom. And the kingdom was never united after that. And even then, by the time we get to Jesus, there's been over 4 centuries of no one sitting on David's throne. So how is God's promise going to be honored? How is God going to be considered faithful with this? I think one of the difficulties in waiting for God's promises, it's one thing just having patience to be waiting for so long a time. It's another thing, as we saw with Abraham, to want to believe and trust in God when the promise seems so out there, so difficult to believe, so miraculous in nature. And then here we get, I think, a third reason why it's difficult to wait. And in this case, it's difficult to wait when it feels like, maybe we've misunderstood God's promise, but it feels like to us that somehow God has not honored the promise that's been made, that God has not been faithful to the covenant. And that's what we're seeing expressed in this psalm. They said, look, you made this unbreakable vow to King David that his descendant would sit on the throne forever. And here we are, and there's no descendant of David on the throne. So God, how are you being faithful to your promise? Now, I think one of the explanations obviously is that, we've talked about like these prophecies that are like mountains with a valley in between, and we don't see the valley. We don't see this valley. They don't see this valley here of this 400 or more than 400 years of no king even on the throne, let alone a descendant of David. And so it's very difficult for them to imagine how God is going to fulfill this promise. I can imagine for many of us too, we have some notion of things that God has promised us. And maybe it's somewhere along the way we felt that God hasn't honored that promise. And so it becomes very difficult to be patient and wait when we feel that God isn't trustworthy. Dave, I'm wondering what you see in this passage and how you have experienced or resolved this own tension in your life.
Well, I can certainly relate to this last piece that you just said, that so oftentimes you're kind of just stuck saying, all right, God, you promised, you promised to protect me. You promised to provide. You promised to lead me to peace and joy. I mean, all these things. You promised your Holy Spirit. You promised you'd never leave me or forsake me. So why do I feel, or why did this happen? And, you've used a couple of the metaphors that you and I've used along the way. The one that I'm always kind of holding on to that is just the most vivid for me for whatever reason is that you can't figure out what story you're in simply by the chapter you're in. And I think that so oftentimes I feel like the story that I'm in is a tragedy, or, it's like a disaster story, And I think I'm so wrapped up sometimes in this present moment. And since I can't see a way from here to the promise, I just think there is no way. But part of what we kind of, I think part of faith is learning to recognize God makes a way when there seems like there is no way. That's the thing that God can do. And that's part of his miraculous power. And so, I mean, really, I just have to trust, even when it makes no sense, and obey, right? And as the old song, trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. One of the ones that Michelle really had struggled with all of her life, Michelle just wanted to be a mom. She had this strong conviction. I've shared before that back when we were kids, she and I started dating when we were in high school. At one point, she had shared that she felt convinced that she was sort of, I thought it was kind of a joke, but I mean, she says it wasn't a joke. She just really felt convinced that she was going to have 10 kids. And I was just like, what a joke. I mean, like, who does that? That'd be dumb. And I told her, okay, and I'm going to be president of the United States. And I thought surely mine is a lot more likely to come true than hers. But then, so she had this dream her whole life of being a mom, and then ended up discovering this challenge with infertility, like she wasn't able to have any kids, and it was just for her, for both of us, but really for her, that was a crushing time, and it was the sadness of not being able to have kids. Okay, that was a piece of it, but a huge piece of it was that she felt so confident about so few things that God had promised or said, or like really kind of told her. She was so sure about this one. It seemed so real. God had put this very strong feeling in her passion in her heart to be this kind of parent. And now, after all that, God wasn't going to allow her to be a parent. And it seemed like there was no way from here to there. And her faith was really crushed. Well, lo and behold, fast forward now, whatever that's been, how many years since then, and well, now we've got too many kids. Now we've got 10. I wish we'd stopped at 10. But there's this sense that God found this weird way of keeping this promise that we just hadn't realized. But then, in fact, God did do this thing, and in fact, 10 really was fewer than it ended up being. Like that, God exceeded the promise, even when that seemed impossible. That's the life of faith, is just learning to trust, right? It's having these confidence in things not yet seen, right? That I don't know how it's going to happen. I don't see it yet, but I'm confident just the same. And I think so much of the life of faith is that way. You know, before we just pass on from this particular passage, one of the things I really like about Psalm 89, one of the things is kind of interesting about it is this section. He's talking about his relationship with David. And he says, I will make him my firstborn son, the mightiest king on earth. Well, that happened. I will love him and be kind to him forever. My covenant with him will never end. I will preserve an heir for him. His throne will be as endless as the days of heaven. That seems like a pretty extravagant, exciting promise. But here's the part. This is a really important piece. Verse 30. But if his descendants forsake my instructions and fail to obey my regulations, if they do not obey my decrees and keep my commands, then I will punish their sin with the rod and their disobedience with the beating. Right? So there's going to be consequences. God's not just saying, oh, this is just a blank check, do anything you want. But this is the part I really love. Verse 33. But I will never stop loving him, nor fail to keep my promise to him. No, I will not break my covenant. That for me, first of all, is just a beautiful thing about God. Like, I will never stop loving him. How many times have I broken the covenant? How many times have I let God down? And yet, you know what the Spirit of God is? Like it should be, David, I'm done with you, you dummy. But what it is I will never stop loving him. Like I find that so moving. But also, and this I'm going to close with a kind of a word of challenge in that I know I was talking to a guy yesterday who is in a very fraught marriage, and his spouse is leaving, is kind of done, and I actually pointed to this very idea and said, yeah, sometimes we don't keep our covenant with God, but you know who always keeps his covenant? It's God. And maybe what it means to follow God is sometimes when people let us down, people hurt us, and they don't keep their covenants to us, and now we are all in our rights to go and do my own thing, and I have no obligation. Well, maybe that's true. You don't have any obligation, but maybe is the opportunity to actually follow God by you continuing to love, by you continuing to serve, by you continuing to honor, and you continuing to protect, by you continuing to keep your covenant that you made with God, not with them. You made a covenant with God about them. And just because they're not keeping their covenant doesn't mean you can't keep yours in some way. And I know that's going to look different in all kinds of situations, but to me, that's just such a beautiful part of the way that God is. God's faithfulness is not dependent on my faithfulness. Thanks be to God.
Yeah, and even when we think that, well, let alone someone else not honoring their covenant, when we think that God perhaps hasn't honored God's covenant, we might be mistaken, like the people in the Psalm were mistaken. They didn't understand how God was going to fulfill that covenant. And they couldn't understand that not only was God going to still honor the covenant, but honor it in a way that was far beyond their imagination, that, that this would lead to Jesus, that this would lead to Messiah, who would literally sit on the throne forever, to never have it be taken away again. In the spirit of Advent, we can look back at a promise like this that seems broken, but realize that we have all the reason in the world to hold on to God's promises and look for an even greater fulfillment than we can understand. Dave, I'm wondering if you'd close this in prayer, because of all the challenges of waiting and holding on to God's promises, I think this is probably a deeper one than the others that we've covered so far.
Yeah, let's pray together. Lord, you tell us in Isaiah 40 that people are like grass. Our faithfulness is like the flowers of the field. It's here today and gone tomorrow. But you always keep your promises. God, we praise you for that in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Everyone, thank you for joining us. And in the spirit of Advent, I pray that you would, I hope that you will remember the ways that God has fulfilled promises to you, so that you can continue to be faithful and trust God during difficult times. Go in peace.